Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thank you for watching Inquiry. Today, I'd like to draw attention to an issue that is plaguing all of us. As the German American philosopher Hannah Arendt said, when you stop having press freedom, anything can happen. She was speaking of what can happen in dictatorships and totalitarian states. But today, something more insidious is taking place. Press freedom is under assault in democracies across the world. This assault has many facets. There's corporate takeover, there's government clampdown, there's extreme polarization, there's the impact of social media, self-censorship, and falling standards within the media itself. As a result, the public has lost trust and faith in the profession. No one's word counts, facts don't matter, and everyone is either corrupt, a stooge, or partisan. So, yes, anything can happen, and it is in fact happening around us all the time. So, what can change the tide, and can it be turned at all? To work through those issues, I'm really happy to have with me at Inquiry today Anya Schiffrin. Anya is on the global board of George Soros's Open Society Foundation. She's the Director of Communication, Media and Technology at Columbia University's School of Public and International Affairs. And she's written two unique and crucial books, one on 100 years of global muckraking and investigative journalism, and another on investigative journalism in Africa. Thank you so much for joining me, Anya.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here.
So, Anya, I've been talking about the kind of assault that media is under. Let's just look at the two biggest democracies in the world. In America, you have a president that's pretty much declared war on the media, routinely calls 3/4 of the nation's media as fake news. And in India, we have a prime minister who bypasses the media, talks directly to people, does not take press conferences. You've been studying media for so long. Can you kind of enumerate the crisis that media is under now?
Sure, absolutely. So I think we have a global attack on journalism, and we have a whole series of what Joel Simon from Committee to Protect Journalists called democratators. So these are people that were elected, but then they turned out to really have autocratic, dictatorial tendencies. So in countries around the world, they have gone after any organization or institution that is evidence-based and does truth-telling. So you have attacks on journalism and science from people like Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro. So it's a terrible moment, and I think everyone in India will be very familiar with the kinds of things that have happened there. And unfortunately, the constant accusations of fake news have helped undermine trust in journalism. And this has come at a time when media outlets were already struggling financially, because in part because the tech companies have taken away a lot of their advertising revenues. So you have outlets that aren't in a position to stick up for themselves in the way that they might have been about 10 or 20 years ago. So it's been a really terrible time for sort of journalism institutions, I would say. A lot of attacks, and we're seeing the results. I've been listening to all of these interesting webinars about COVID-19, and the problem is when you start calling media fake news and then you start pushing disinformation about COVID, you wind up with a lot of confused people, and many of them don't follow social distancing guidelines, or they don't know what to do. And it's actually physically extremely dangerous. So I think this moment during the pandemic has shown us why quality information is incredibly important. And trust is rising. But these institutions are under attack just when you would think governments would wake up and realize how much they need them.
But the problem, Anya, is that the consensus around media itself has broken down. So, people like you and me may see ourselves as being believers in liberal democracy, as constitutionalists, and that one's combat or criticism of governments is a principled professionalism. But those governments today have come with very popular mandates, and their followers see what they call liberal media or establishment media as being very partisan. So the entire definition of media itself is under assault. And can you help redefine that or put it back on the table?
Yeah, and I also wanted to say the interesting thing about these leaders is even though they hate the media and they complain about the media, they also really believe in capturing the media. So what they have done and what we've seen all around the world is this tendency where the government gets their cronies to run media outlets. So they still believe in the idea of messaging and public information. They just want it in the hands of their cronies, whether it's Rupert Murdoch and Fox, or whether it's, all of the capture that has led to the self-censorship in India. So yeah, I think we're in a situation of total polarization. And there have been all these new studies showing that people in the US that watch Fox are doing less social distancing. They're putting themselves more at risk. One of the studies was done by a colleague at Columbia. So we're in this crazy world where for educated, literate people who want quality information, more is available now than ever. And we see remarkable reporting every single day. And then for the rest of the world that's just sitting on their WhatsApp group or on Fox, they're seeing all kinds of garbage. And unfortunately, they're believing it. And I agree, how we come back from that is really difficult. I'm at the moment writing a book on policies to address mis and disinformation. So, I'm thinking about that a lot of the time, as you can imagine.
Little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Anya, I'll come to some of the other issues that you've raised, but for now, if you can just focus on the highly polarized nature of our politics. The problem is that in a democracy, if a very large percentage of people, take America and India, for instance, which is the two countries that we belong to, if a large percentage of people believe that the high quality journalism that you're referring to is itself partisan, then what do you do? So for instance, in India, what was traditionally seen as mainstream media is considered to be soft on Congress. And in America, a large number of people who like Donald Trump see the New York Times to be soft on Democrats. And on the flip side, recently the New York Times opinion editor had to resign for carrying a piece that did not sit well with the overall philosophy of the New York Times and its readers. The New Yorker got into trouble for inviting Steve Bannon to an event. So, how are any of these divides to be bridged? If even the media cannot engage with the other side, how will the suspicion and gaps be bridged at all? Can you talk about that?
Well, I think a few things. By the way, on the Tom Cotton op-ed that you're referring to in the New York Times, I think there were also problems with some of the facts and the incorrect information in the first few paragraphs. So, and the way he characterized the protest. So I think it wasn't just his opinion. I think it was also real questions about the facts. So there's a lot of effort being put into this right now. One thing that's happening is there's a whole movement afoot to really reach out to audiences and to engage with communities. And it's a little bit like the public service, the sort of public civic journalism movement of the 1990s. So all across the country, you have media outlets that are going into communities, asking people what information they want, trying to get them involved in reporting, trying to get them involved, getting them to come to the newsrooms, learn about who we are, learn about what we do. So that's one thing. The community engagement movement is alive and well right now. Another thing that's happening is a lot of attempts to do news literacy. So there are groups like the American Association for Media Literacy Education. There's the Center at Stony Brook, University of New York. And they've got programs where they'll take journalists and bring them out into schools and teach students, what are journalists? What do we do? So that's, those are two big movements that are happening. And then, of course, there's the fact on the cheerful side, which is that demand for quality information has never been higher. So the New York Times now has an enormous audience. The Conversation, which is made up of academics who get edited by journalists. And so it's very high quality information. I think their readership is something like tripled. So we do see massive movements around the world to engage with audiences, show them how to differentiate high quality information. And I think that's fantastic. I think the problem with a lot of those is that they're very, very labor intensive. And so they're by necessity, they're small scale. When I was last in Bangalore in the fall, giving a lecture there. I had a really interesting time talking to some of the people who are running, local media outlets. I saw Mira Kay, running local media outlets and really engaging with community. So that is going on.
To bring you back to my question about this difficulty of talking around polarized positions. So you can speak to the converted and you can speak to your own constituencies. But there was a time when media was meant for the entire society, Where do you stand on this whole issue of platforming or speaking to people whose beliefs don't sit well with you? Where would you weigh in on that debate?
Yeah, so I guess what I was trying to say, and thank you for bringing me back to your main point, is that the people who do these efforts really hope that will build trust in media.
Sorry, Anya, but I was wanting you to weigh in personally on what you think about talking across polarized divides. Would you, for instance, support a really controversial, editorial or an opinion piece to be hosted by the New York Times? Would you speak to a Steve Bannon, even if you, vehemently disagree with his views? What do you think the role of the media is in a polarized society?
So what I was going to say was that, I think these community efforts are good. But they're small scale. So another thing I'm a really great believer in, like what I think we should be doing, is more support for public service broadcasting. I actually think that's way more important than whether or not the New Yorker hosts Steve Bannon. I think that countries that have high quality public service broadcasters are countries that in general have more trust in institutions and more trust in journalism. And, it's not just Sweden, which is always better than everybody at everything, but it's countries like Australia, it's the BBC in the UK. And I think that there's an important role for government to play and for independent broadcasters. And I know it's been very, very fashionable to criticize the BBC. And, before COVID, there was a lot of attacks from the left and from the right. And my take is, the old Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you've got till it's gone.
So Anya, I mean, these are really all the riddles of our time, but you just mentioned public broadcasting, their government plays a role in allocating funds. Now, when we're talking about governments that themselves are subverting some of the fundamentals, not of electoral democracy, but constitutional democracy. So, at that point, the government actually will capture public institutions, and it certainly is doing that in both our countries at this point, So how do we safeguard on that?
Well, like I said, what we're doing now in the US is groups like Free Press are trying to look a little bit more locally. So, for example, they got New Jersey to agree to set aside funding for investigative journalism. We've also, they've also got a proposal out to tax Facebook and Google and try to get that to support journalism. So I agree with you. If you've got government control of the public service broadcaster and they've sort of turned it into a propaganda arm, then funding your broadcaster isn't going to help. But then I think we get back to a lot of the more local institutions. And this is what's happening in the US right now. So, I mean, you've really got you've got basically three choices, right? Either you get small scale initiatives, which are great, but they don't scale and they're expensive and they need funding. Or you make sure that you preserve your courts and your large institutions, your universities, your scientific research, and your public service broadcasters, or you lean on the private sector. Right. And it's difficult, right? And then, of course, there's international pressure. Can you get the UN? Can you get international organizations to shame these leaders into behaving better? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
So Anya, before we try to zero in on any solutions, I wanted to kind of stir the pot and lay out all the troubles and dangers that media institutions and press freedom face today. And we've already looked at some of the problems that can arise out of publicly funded institutions, especially if there's an autocratic government in power. And the whole issue with privately funded institutions, the issue of corporate capture is too well known to go into. But what is intriguing is the whole area of philanthropically funded media institutions. And I was intrigued to see that even though you've served on George Soros's Open Society Foundation, you've said that donor-driven media institutions can itself be problematic. And the Open Society Foundation, usually protects a very positive agenda of constitutional rights, the right to freedom, individual liberty, the right to dissent, right to information, independent journalism, sort of people's movements. And yet you're saying that that itself is a mandate or an agenda that journalistic outfits have to face. And very often, people who oppose that worldview also say that, oh, this is an agenda set by the donor. So how is one to escape this whole labyrinth of distrust?
So I think, in general, in an ideal world, I would like to see all these zillionaires pay their taxes. So they wouldn't have all these billions to give away. But we're not in an ideal world. We're in a country where zillionaires don't pay taxes. And so what we've got are these enormous foundations now and that are putting money into journalism. And I think 10 years ago, I thought this is terrible, journalists shouldn't take it. And now I've really converted. So I think it's very important for journalists to take money where they can, even if it's from philanthropists. But I do think it's important to put in safeguards so as to make sure that philanthropists don't just become yet another
voice
owner
of the master.
Yeah. And I think at Open Society Foundation, obviously I'm biased, but I know it really well, so I can speak. I was 9 years on the journalism board, which gives away about $14 million a year to journalism. And they are staffed by a lot of former journalists and have extremely strict rules about not telling journalists what to write about or what to cover. So they've supported all kinds of independent outlets all over the world, and I think have performed an incredible public service. The other thing that they've done, and which donors have done generally, is supported a lot more cross-border investigations and collaboration between countries and the North and the South. So, Panama Papers, Luxembourg leaks, the work of the ICIJ has been really important because they brought journalists in Africa and Latin America together to work with journalists in Northern Europe. And they've not only broken enormous stories, but they've also found great ways to build collaboration and get people to work together. So Drew Sullivan, who runs the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project with Paul Radu, they always say, crime doesn't stop at the border, so why should journalism? So we're in this sort of paradoxical moment where journalists are under attack, and they're having all kinds of problems with funding, including just since COVID. The amount of advertising revenue has absolutely declined enormously. Tivinyane from Botswana wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago saying he thinks that at the end of this, there may not be one single African newspaper left.
My God.
Lumine Foundation has said, this may be an extinction event for many media outlets. So we're in this sort of terrible financial situation and under huge political pressure. But the reporting being done by the journalists is absolutely top notch, and there's more collaboration and more of a spirit of community and conferences where people can go and meet each other and work together. And there's really a global community of sort of high quality investigative journalism now, and that's really largely thanks to Open Society Foundation and now other funders as well, like Ford and Lumine. So a lot of credit to the donors for helping create that.
I agree. I think we're living in such a highly polarized world today that it doesn't serve much purpose to see, what one's political affiliation or belief system is. The focus should really be on whether something is fact-based or not fact-based. Is there evidence or not evidence? Otherwise, you can discredit anybody. And, it's an open marketplace of ideas. And if there's huge money backing a certain idea of development and big development, why shouldn't there be money that backs another worldview, which may be focused on climate change or on sustainable development or people's rights? After all, that's just a battle place of ideas, and it's an open marketplace of ideas. So money should be allowed to back both worldviews. That's at least how I think about it.
Well, I think Misha Ketchel from The Conversation has a really good point, which is he said, when people say like, oh, universities or philanthropists shouldn't intervene, then it's like, oh, so the only people that get to have an opinion are business people? Like, why would that be? Why is it more valid for a big company to own a media outlet or a big, gazillionaire business person than a university, right? Or a donor? So I agree with you. I think that all the voices need to be heard. I think that the problem right now almost is being heard. And Zeynep Tufekci talks about this, right? There's so much noise out there that what traction can the high quality journalism get? And how can it change the conversation? And more than changing the conversation, what can that lead to? So we did a study with a couple of my colleagues, including a Brazilian PhD student at Columbia called Alex Gonçalves, where we looked at the campaigns for tax justice by some of the British NGOs. And then we looked at the Panama Papers to see which produced more conversation on social media. And what we found was that it was really the Panama Papers that after that came out, there was so much discussion, in the houses, in European Parliament, in individual governments about the problem of tax avoidance. So I think that the journalism, when it can be heard and when people take notice, can have a huge impact. And very often what it does is it sort of reinforces all the work that was done by NGOs over long periods of time. And this, of course, is the subject of the two books I edited, Global Muckraking and African Muckraking. Yeah.
I'm in fact going to come to those books, Anya, but you just raised a point which I was really curious to ask you about, which is that, there was a time when information was power. You put out a story,
Yeah.
That's what governments lived in fear of. That's why media was considered the watchdog. You've spelled out maybe a couple of big stories now that have made big impact. The Panama Papers are one of them. But the counter to that is that journalists are living with this despairing sense of being utterly irrelevant, pointless. You might put out stories and information is no longer power. And Mr. Trump does that routinely. Like he's just gone across a boundary where information just doesn't matter, And even in India, there are stories that are put out. If society and governments ignore those stories, what's a journalist supposed to do, So you're living with this new existential crisis. Do you feel that despair, or is one being unnecessarily sort of negative and depressed?
So this comes up in conversation all the time. I mean, the first year that Trump was in power, all the journalists thought, look, if we just expose the money laundering and we just expose all these terrible things, something will happen. The man will get impeached or somebody will do something. And journalists have always believed that if you have information, people will act. I mean, this is all of that work Amartya Sen did on famine and democracy, right? And then the subsequent research by people like Tim Besley, it was all based on the idea if people have information, they will act. So right now, as you say, journalists feel really frustrated. We're reporting all this interesting stuff. What's happening? Why isn't anything happening? And I would say two things. First of all, you never, ever know when the information will suddenly cause action and when it will flare up. And, a perfect example is what's happening now in the US with Black Lives Matter, or what happened with the Me Too movement. So we've known for years that these were terrible problems. Police brutality was a terrible problem. Sexism against women was a terrible problem. But all of a sudden, it just sort of catches fire. And what we did in the Global Muckraking book was we saw Global Muckraking included pieces of investigative journalism from the Global South for the past 150 years. And for some reason, no one had ever done that before. Nobody had taken pieces of investigative journalism from the Global South and put them all together. So the idea was to see how did they cover famine in Bengal, right, in 1940, versus in China. How was an earthquake covered, or a trafficking story, right? Because people were writing about trafficking in India in 1870, 1880. So we got really interested in seeing how all of this was covered, and then why did it sometimes have an impact and sometimes it didn't. And the answer was often, was there an NGO, was there civil society, was there another group already working on this problem? And then when the journalism happened, there was this kind of fantastic moment when they came together and they had an impact. So that's, one point. The second point is it can take a really, really long time. And the third point is you have to be really, really vigilant. My friend Alexis McGill Johnson, who's now head of Planned Parenthood in America, says she stopped saying, "What? Are we arguing about this again?" And she started saying, "Not on my watch." not on my watch, not while I'm here. So these things, labor conditions, exploitation, oppression of Black people, people of color, women, LGBTQ, economic injustice, all of these problems are happening all the time. And so you just have to sort of keep fighting them and keep exposing them. And sometimes it makes a difference. And, I do in the book and in my lectures to my students, I definitely have sort of ideas about when it makes a difference, when it doesn't. Obviously, the case of Trump is illustrative. He's talking to his base. So if we attack him for certain things, he may not care because his base doesn't care, right? Yeah. And Modi, I imagine, is the same way, right? He's got huge supporters and he wants to keep them happy, not necessarily the people like us, or take China, right? Sometimes a lot of the criticism of China, all it does is it helps the government because they don't really care about the foreign criticism. So it depends a lot on how big you are, how accountable you are, what you're trying to prove, who you're trying to prove it to, for journalism to make a difference. Yeah.
So, in India, Anya, it's true. You talked about this ecosystem of justice that enables journalism to have impact. It's civil societies, judiciary. It's first of all an audience that's interested. In India, we've seen a lot of civil society's back has been broken. We have a lot of activists in jail. India has come to 142 on the Global Press Freedom Index. Just in the last 2 months, we have 55 FIRs against journalists. We have the terrorism UAPA, which allows an individual to be declared a terrorist, being invoked against journalists. We have sedition cases against journalists just for being critical of government. So there is a kind of many faceted assault on media. But I come back to that conundrum, Anya, and I'd love you to clarify that we're operating in a democracy. You may not like what democracy throws up, but it's been democratically thrown up. And as long as there's a constituency where today the media is seen as an enemy of the people, Mr. Trump very often presents the media as an enemy of the people. Mr. Modi presents a lot of dissenters or intellectuals as being anti-national. There's an intellectual challenge there to reclaim legitimacy and credibility. Is there a new vocabulary that media has to, I'll be partisan, let's say liberal media has to couch itself in that sense?
But Trump is losing support in the United States dramatically. I mean, the polls are showing he's tanking. And this older citizens are all now moving over to Biden. So I do think you can lie a certain amount, but eventually people are just dying. We were having arguments over the weekend because a friend of a friend was saying, well, the tests aren't true. They're just testing more people, blah, blah, blah. But, the hospitals are filling up. So when that happens, that's not just, there's more testing. That is, more people are getting sick. I mean, I wish I had some great solution for you. I don't. Ivan Krastev says now that all of us, instead of being evangelical, we become monasteries. Like, a lot of what we're trying to do is just hold what we've got and make sure that when the lights come back on, whenever that takes, we've educated the next generation and we have preserved some of our institutions. I come from a family of refugees, right? My family left Russia in 1917. My father and my grandparents left Paris in 1941 to escape the Nazis, and my family in Spain were Republicans who fought against Franco and had to leave in 1939. So we've lived in my family now for two generations fleeing dictatorships. So, obviously I think all the time about when is it time to flee. So I don't want to pretend that, we're all going to sit here and get through this, but I also think we have to keep the flame alive. And that's also what a lot of the global muckrakers did. So nobody paid attention to their reporting when it was put out. But 10 years later, 20 years later, there were prosecutions of war crimes, or there were, Pinochet, some of Pinochet's people were put on trial. And guess what? That journalism that was there was used as evidence. One of the things that, I know I'm not supposed to be interviewing you, Shoma, but one of the things that really interests me is that my Indian friends don't want to leave India. Over and over again, I keep hearing them say, we're staying. We're not abandoning our family, the next generation, our children. Since I come from a family of refugees, I'm always like, okay, when's it time to go? When is this too dangerous? So I think if you're not leaving, then you have to stay and either fight or sort of hibernate or go local until it's safe to kind of stick your head back up. I don't know what you think. Yeah.
One, I believe that all the structures of media are full of very, very good individuals, but the structures have become so compromised for many reasons of media capture, whether it's political or corporate, and it's become very difficult to do good work, but they are fantastic professionals in literally every institution. So, and as you said, like there's an incremental fact that you may feel hopeless and existential about the work you're doing, but if you're allowed to do it and you are not losing your job, then there is, just the fact that it's there for posterity, that itself is a pushback.
One other thing to that point, which is that when I was doing the research for the books, one of the things that we observed was that every time there's a democratic transition, you get a huge number of new media outlets. So this was in, France after World War II, or Indonesia after Suharto, or Ghana, after Rawlings. Like all of a sudden there's this huge flowering. And then many of them don't survive financially, but there is a flowering. So when our countries start to feel more democratic again or freer again, I'm sure that all those journalists in hibernation and that next generation are going to suddenly sort of pop up again. Yeah. Anyway, you want to ask about my books? Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your books, but you've again opened something that I feel needs immediate attention, which is that, Anya, there's this, it really is it's a big riddle, which is that when there's a vast number of people who feel that, in fact, we're the problem, that we're establishment, we were partisan, we were not vigilant, we're the ones who are politically doctrinaire, we're not democratic, we were protecting only certain constituencies. There is a lot of that. In India, there's this, Lutyens Delhi, with the elite. So, in fact, even as we're pushing back on, as I said, it's perfectly good to have a value system and you push back on what you feel is undermining the constitution. But at the same time, do you think that there's some introspection that liberals need to do? Why is the liberal democratic project so discredited right now? Are there mistakes we've made? What would you list as mistakes we've made?
So I think that it was really interesting after Trump got elected, because we did a huge amount of browbeating or chest beating. And, journalists always think that it all comes back to journalism. So all the journalists said, this was our fault. We should have been out there covering the red states. We should have been telling their stories. There's all these initiatives now to hire new journalists and bring in people I was at a conference recently. I think I met like 3 reporters from West Virginia who'd gotten funding. Then I always have to say, I hate to break it to you, but I don't know if it's really all about the journalism. If you've got incredible economic inequality and injustice, really the journalists can do something, but I'm not sure that's why there's all this anger in our societies. I think, it's been directed by opportunists over to the journalists to deflect attention. But really what went wrong in America? We know what went wrong, right? We had a neoliberal economic order. Jobs were lost. Manufacturing jobs were gone. People started taking, opioids. Our welfare state was dismantled. To me, those are the crucial things that cause instability. And you can go ahead and blame journalists if you want to and accuse them of being the elite, but that to me is not where the process of repair needs to come from, right?
Yeah. Well, of course, there's the massive irony of having, one of the most rich, non-tax-paying capitalists representing the working class voice in America, so that itself is its own irony.
Oh, I would just add, the recent studies that were done last year, was it by Van Elst, on media trust in Europe? It's that same thing, where for some reason, normal people think that the tabloids represent them, right? And the sort of Times of London or the Telegraph is too elite, which I'm sure is true. But it is, as you say, completely ironic to think that a zillionaire like Rupert Murdoch, they were lying, by the way. While they were on Fox saying COVID wasn't happening, they were handing out hand sanitizer in their New York office and canceling Rupert Murdoch's birthday party. So it's really remarkable to think that some of these tabloids represent the people.
I'm just going to pursue this because I hope there's a very varied spectrum of people who will watch this interview and not just those who agree with us. So,
Yeah.
there's that sense that, say, on some very complex issues, whether it's of identity, whether it's on immigration, there are societies that have felt in a crouch position, especially concentrated areas where there's a big influx of migrants, right or wrong. There's an emotion attached to it. And do you think that one has not had the intellectual courage to give that an airing, give that a fair hearing, to maybe arrive at some positions which are not necessarily politically correct, maybe more middle road, not just declare them to be basket of deplorables, but really give legitimacy to other people's experiences in an intellectually honest way?
Sure, but by the way, in the US, the people voting for Trump and the most anti-immigrant are not the states with immigrants, FYI. It's not New York City. It's Kentucky and places. And we've actually talked to politicians in those states. We were in Kentucky who said to their constituents, Obama brought you health care. That has benefited you. Why are you voting Republican? And they're like, we don't like the Mexicans. And they're like, it's Kentucky. We have no Mexicans. So I do think, absolutely, I understand where you're going, but I also think we have to be a little careful about not generalizing. We are polarized now, and I don't feel, I think I'm interested in economic justice and fair economic policies, and helping provide a social safety net. But I'm not sure that that's what we can do. I don't know that I can do anything about your racism, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. No,
I don't know. I don't know what to do about that. I don't know what to do about that. I really am sorry. You've reached the limits of what I can do.
Yeah. No, I wanted to
criticize times to some extent, and I think obviously they need to do more, and everybody needs to do more. But I also don't know what difference that's going to make either. I mean, the conversations I've had on the other side, honestly, if the New York Times covered Kentucky more in detail, I think that's great. But is that going to stop some Trump supporter from voting for Trump and being a racist? I don't know. We have the evidence for that, frankly.
So, Anya, to now come to your books, will you outline a couple of the most fierce, inspiring stories that you came across? And, I think unlike anyone else, you've compiled a book also on investigative journalism in Africa and also global journalism. So just pick maybe just two of your choicest, most fierce stories.
Wow. Well, I do think that the coverage in India of the Bengal famine, I think was really important. I think that Dwarkanath Ganguly's writing about trafficking in the late 19th century were real highlights. I think that there's been so much good investigative reporting in Africa more recently on things like oil, gas, and mining. Corruption stories continue to be important. For me, it's always labor stories. They're often the most inspiring. So we include some of the early work on Nike and on the shrimp farming and the fishing boat stories by Benjamin Skinner and other people. I judge every year. I'm on one of the panels for the Overseas Press Club Award. And so there's really fantastic reporting going on all over the world. I'm thinking of some of the stuff on Apple and the working conditions in Malaysia. Some of the work by Martha Mendoza as well on labor conditions and textile, footwear, garment factories. So I think there's some, a whole new generation of labor reporters who are taking over from where people like Steve Greenhouse were. I read a wonderful book about, prison exposés. This is an ongoing subject that people have been writing about for more than 100 years. So there's some great stuff that's been happening on jails as well. So I'm a big fan. I love the Daily Maverick in South Africa. I subscribe to their newsletter. I really like Caravan as well. So I think there's fantastic investigative reporting going on right now. I think a lot of the reporting about disinformation and the tech companies and how badly they've behaved, I think Wired has done a good job of covering that in the US and the UK. So yeah, there's a lot of good things to read right now, that's for sure.
So in the balance, are you sort of hopeful about journalism, or do you feel this is in some ways the high tide of journalism, or are you feeling that this is like, journalism is under assault, it's a kind of death gasp of the profession?
I think it's a bad moment, but I also love the sort of fresh, big thinking. So Luminate and BBC Media Action are trying to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to support media institutions around the world. So Victor Pickard and the Free Press in the US. So I really think it's a time to go for broke and to support, Reporters Without Borders with their forum on democracy. So I just think it's time to go for broke and support the big picture ideas that will secure, quality journalism and reporting into the future. And I definitely think that Facebook and Google, they've got to be taxed. They've got to be taxed, and they should be paying for all this stuff as well, I think.
That's a great entry point to this question, which was on technology and social media, the algorithms. Of course, social media is, again, democratized voices, but it's also taken away all centrality. And, the way the algorithms are constructed, there is a kind of, denuding of media and journalism that's happened because of the technology giants. Could you spell that out? And what do you think can be pushbacks without taking away its strengths?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important for the tech companies to make their algorithms far more public, and they should be supervised as well. So I think we need regulatory agencies to supervise the tech companies. I think the amount of freedom they've had is absurd. In France, I think that they actually have a law that algorithms have to be made available to the government. So I think we need far more transparency. I think we need an end to all the micro-targeting and far more privacy regulation. So something like Germany's GDPR, I think, is incredibly important. And then lastly, we need to tax them. We need to tax them properly. We need to use the money to, pay for journalism and other things. So I don't think we can tackle the tech companies without massive regulation and government intervention. So I spent last fall teaching in Paris, did a lot of interviews with regulators in Europe, and I've totally come over to that view. And we need things like the Honest Ads Act. We need transparency of political advertising. We need to know who's paying for it. They need to clamp down on, information being paid for, advertising being paid for by foreign interests and stuff like that. So I think there's piles of things we need to do to regulate the tech companies. And, I don't know that the US is going to do it we're not going to do it unless we get Biden in. Although Trump has said he supports carving out or repealing Section 230. And I think the Europeans are going to have to lead the way on a lot of this. And I just hope they do. I'm a huge fan of Margaret Vestager.
Yeah, she's fantastic. Yeah.
Competition. So we're going to have to look, I think, a lot to Europe and other countries as well.
Thank you, Anya.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again for watching. If you found this interview interesting, do press the subscribe button on the ENQUIRY YouTube channel. Watch our other interviews. And of course, if you like, do press the like button. Thank you so much.